Good afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Birdsall House in the Center for Global Development. It's my pleasure to welcome you and to introduce to you our founding chairman, Ed Scott.
It's a great pleasure to greet you all today, and I thank you very much for coming. Those of you who are members of the Center's staff, I won't repeat my observations a few moments ago, but I will just remind those who are not on the staff that this will be the last time that I will be addressing you as the chairman, or perhaps addressing you, period. But we have the great good luck to have someone taking over the chairmanship of CGD who actually knows something about economics and development. We did not benefit from that when I started this organization. I had a gleam in my eye, but I suffered from a lack of real understanding of the issues. But Nancy and her team have certainly educated me over the last 13 years, and now I have some minimal modicum of understanding of the subject, which allows me to fake it when I'm an intelligent company. But Nancy Birdsall and I have been partners in this enterprise for 13 years, and I just want you to know what a great her to know, and for you to know what a great privilege it's been for me to have her both as a friend and intellectual mentor. And I think we together have built, I can say immodestly, a great institution and a capacity that the world really needs. And I'm very proud of that fact and very pleased about it. So I thank you very much for your presence, and I look forward to another many years of CGD success. And I give you Nancy Birdsall, the president of the Center for Global Development.
Thank you, Ed. I'm delighted to welcome all of you here. It is really, as Ed suggested, a momentous occasion for CGD. First of all, to be in our new space and to have the changing of the guard to which Ed just referred, welcoming the new chair of our board, Larry Summers. We just finished our annual board meeting this morning, and many of our board members are here with us today, which is terrific. It is, as Ed indirectly implied, a bittersweet occasion for me and for him, although he has promised to stay on the board and on the executive committee, so we can continue conspiring together. But it is the last one where, as he said, he has been the chair. Some of you were here for Ed's remarks about a month ago, in which he reminded us again that the Center for Global Development is not a sandbox for economists. It is a place where we want to change the world, in particular to make it better for the 3, 4, 5 billion people outside the advanced economies in the developing world who are far behind, who have tough lives, who are struggling all the time, so many of them. And that's what we're all about, is making their lives better by dealing with what we're doing here in the rich world. After his remarks a month ago, Ed held a candid conversation about the power of informed philanthropy to change the world with David Callahan, who's the founder of a dynamic new information platform called Inside Philanthropy. And that made us all very happy because subsequently, first, David described Ed as Silicon Valley's most effective global giver. And effective because, among other things, he was so generous in making the commitment with which we started at the Center for Global Development. But I did want to say and repeat for some of you that Ed has done a lot of giving in other ways to other groups. And I won't name them all, but I was just reminded, talking to Ed at the luncheon table, that he is the one, unbeknownst to anyone because he doesn't like to toot his own horn, who literally wrote the Memorandum of Understanding, which led to the creation of a group called DATA with Bono, Gates Foundation, George Soros, and Ed Scott. And that group subsequently became what's called ONE, which has been absolutely central in putting development amongst young people, particularly in the U.S., on their agenda. David Callahan then has since published a terrific piece on the Center for Global Development, which I think we've made available somewhere, and I hope you'll pick it up. Is it somewhere, Lawrence, available for people?
There on the way out. It wasn't there on the way in.
All right. So it's bragging. Sorry to do some bragging. So we're very thrilled with all this recognition, but I want to say none of this would have happened without the original vision that Ed brought of bringing together thinking and doing to make the world a better place. It's a real vision. I think we've been successful in realizing it, and I'm glad we'll still have Ed with us to keep us on our toes with his passion and his commitment and his impatience. So Ed, would you rise and face the audience for one last round of thanks? Come on. So now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Ed's successor. Many of you will know him, of course, the new chair of the CGD board, Larry Summers. Everything that Larry has done is well known to all of you. What's great about having him as the chair is he's a world-class scholar and a top-level policy practitioner. Not all of you may know that Larry has had an abiding, passionate interest in development. And that's the other reason it's very exciting for us to have him as the chair, because he's sending a signal to the rest of the world that someone like Larry sees this as a critical issue in this century. I first met Larry when he came to the World Bank to be the chief economist. And what I remember at the time, it was in 1991, is that the World Bank and the IMF and the development finance community, the international economics community, had been struggling and talking about macroeconomic problems in the developing world, the debt issue, structural adjustment, macro. And I was one of many economists working in the World Bank at the time on health and education. And there were others working on energy, financial markets, and so on. What Larry did is he brought unbelievable energy, creativity, and excitement to those of us who'd been laboring, in the basement, while this larger discussion was taking up a lot of the air around what was happening in the developing world. So, and I also remember, of course, as many others here do who are concerned about women in development, one of the first things that Larry did is he went to Pakistan and gave a speech that I think will be, sort of held in memory for many of us about the centrality of girls' education. And he had the data, and he had the evidence, and he had the scholarship to say the returns to girls' education are demonstrably greater than the returns to any particular, I think in that case it was a hydroelectric dam, which actually we're quite for here at the Center for Global Development. I'm very pleased and looking forward to Larry's remarks. He's, I think, going to say something about the international financial institutions, taking us back in some ways to his days as chief economist at the World Bank and, of course, as the Secretary of the Treasury for the U.S. It's an important issue for the U.S. and for development, and one that many of us here at the Center for Global Development have spilled too much ink about. And of course, Larry knows the issues very well. After Larry's remarks, he will be joined by Steve Inskeep, the host of Morning Edition, well known to any of you by voice, if not in person. Morning Edition is one of the most widely heard radio programs in the United States, and Steve will be interviewing Larry. Then we'll have some questions from the floor. Just a word on Steve. He has a long-time interest in development. He's the author of a terrific book that I read because of our work on the U.S. approach to development in Pakistan, called Instant City, Life and Death in Karachi. It's a story of ordinary, heroic people and their struggles to build one of the world's great megacities, which in many ways is troubled at the moment. And Steve also recently did a series, probably many of you heard, on the border, life at the border between Mexico and the U.S. Steve, we're very delighted to have you here today and privileged. Now, please join me in welcoming the new chair of the board, Larry Summers.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Let me first say that by now I have had a variety of positions in my life, and in every one of them, since I'm not an entrepreneur, I have had a predecessor. And in none of them have I had a predecessor who was as profound and transformative in the role as Ed Scott. And it is an honor to succeed him. Congratulations, Ed, on everything you've done. What Nancy was too modest to say is that one of the reasons I made such a fuss and put such emphasis around issues of health and education when I was at the World Bank was because she inspired me to do that with the power of her scholarship, the strength of her advocacy, and the extremity of her persistence. It was a privilege for me to promote Nancy during my time at the World Bank. It was a privilege for me to work with Nancy during her time as the Executive Vice President of the Inter-American Development Bank. It has been a privilege for me to serve on the board of the Center for Global Development, and I very much look forward to working with Nancy in the future. This organization is blessed with a remarkable leader. Thank you, Nancy. This organization is blessed in three other ways. It is blessed now with really beautiful space. This space is terrific, and I had not seen it before yesterday, and it really is remarkable space, and congratulations to all those who brought this about. This organization, as those of us who were at the board meeting this morning had a chance to see, and those like me who follow the Center's website have a regular chance to observe, is blessed with remarkably energetic, creative, thoughtful, and action-oriented staff. And an organization like this would be nothing without those who carry on its work of research and advocacy. So I want to just say thank you to the staff and how much I admire all of you and all of the work you do. And the last thing I would say is that the Center for Global Development is blessed with a tremendous mission. There is no mission that is more morally important to the future of humanity than the work of development. It is the difference between life and death for tens of millions of people. It is the difference between lives of toil and drudgery and lives of emancipation, freedom, and opportunity. And it is central to the objective we all share of a peaceful and secure and sustainable planet. So it is a wonderful mission that the Center for Global Development has, and I am very proud and glad to have a chance to contribute to it going forward. This is an extraordinary moment, I believe, in history. You can see that in many ways, some more positive, some less positive. At one level, there's immense things to be happy about. The fraction of people who die in war now is about 15% of what it was in the 1960s, 1970s, or early 1980s. Child mortality rates have halved since we wrote the World Development Report on Health at the World Bank in the early 1990s. And the commission I was just privileged to chair, celebrating the 20th anniversary of that report, highlighted the fact that it is within reach that globally, child mortality rates by 2035 will be where they were in the United States or the United Kingdom in the 1990s. That at the same time, a kind of grand convergence in health is possible, where, again, life expectancies will be relatively similar all over the world, not at 40, as was the case in 1800, but in the 70s or approaching 80 by 2035. And similar kinds of remarkable progress are being observed with respect to education, with respect to sanitation, with respect to other indicia of material progress. And so no one should suppose that when we talk about challenges, that progress is impossible or that there are any grounds for fatalism. There are millions of children who live each year who would have died a generation ago, and there will be millions more who will survive a generation from now. It is also true, though, that this is a moment in a different sense of real concern. And it's concern that, for me, has a great deal to do with decisions that our nation, the United States, will make in the years ahead. 3 wars ended during the 20th century: World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. The verdict of history is clear. The peace was lost after the First World War. Versailles, reparations, U.S. abandonment of the League of Nations, punitive debt collection, increasing tariffs, depression, economic frustration leading to nationalism, and the Second World War. It is clear that the peace was won after the Second World War. Bretton Woods, the United Nations, GATT, the Marshall Plan, the reconstruction of Europe, the reform in Japan, spectacular economic progress, faster for humanity as a whole than ever before in history. Ultimately, the successful containment of the communist threat, the reintegration of China into the global economic system with immense progress. The third war that ended in the 20th century was the Cold War. And I would confidently have said 5 years ago that the peace had been successfully won after the Cold War, that an international order of growing economic integration, great prosperity, the emergence of emerging markets, the absence of conflict between great powers had been established. Yes, profound moral challenges pointed up by words like Haiti, Rwanda, Bosnia, Kosovo, Myanmar. Yes, profound terrorist threats pointed up by dates like September 11th and names like Al-Qaeda. But that fundamentally, if you took a large macro scale view of it, the peace had been won. I still think that is probably right. But as I think about what a potentially revanchist Russia in Ukraine means, I think about the cauldron that is the Middle East. I think about the chilliness of the peace in Northeast Asia. I am not entirely certain. And when I think about the global public goods, or maybe I should call them the global public challenges that are going unmet. Climate change, where the rate at which coal-burning power plants get installed on planet Earth has never been more rapid. Nuclear proliferation, where in the last month, the first time a security guarantee given to a country that renounced nuclear weapons has been ignored. Pandemic, where optimists tell me the chance of a pandemic is 0.5 to 0.75% every year, which makes it really possible that there will be one in my children's lifetime. And pessimists say it's 2% a year, which makes it almost certain that there will be one in my children's lifetime. And where the budget of the World Health Organization for influenza is half that of New York City and less than the annual budget of the Center for Global Development. There are real questions as to whether the peace is going to stay won. And ultimately, it seems to me that it is that reality that needs to frame questions about international economic policy, questions about development, and questions about the foreign policy of the United States. It should not escape us that we come together at the 100th anniversary of the start of the First World War, an event that would have been regarded as inconceivable in April of 1914, that we come together at the 75th anniversary of the start of the Second World War, an event that had been preordained by mistakes that had already been made before 1939, that we come together at the 50th anniversary of a moment of maximum hubris when the United States dissipated its enormous capacity to do good with a misguided intervention in Vietnam. And we come together in the 25th anniversary of the year when the Cold War ended, with all the changes that that brought about, and from which we now see that the peace has not been entirely won. I believe that whether the peace will stay won after the Cold War will depend more than anything else on the capacity of the United States to provide continued global leadership and to underwrite a global system in which cooperation and constructive behavior is the rational choice for self-interested actors around the world. And there, I have my concerns. Concerns that are not our subject today with respect to our willingness to underwrite the physical security of that system, where I have to wonder whether in the dangerous world that I described, it can possibly be right for us to head to the smallest military since 1940. But more importantly, concerns about our capacity to and our willingness to undergird the international cooperative aspects of such a system that reward and reinforce stakeholders who choose to participate, and that permits us to address the global public goods challenges to which I have referred. Think about where we are. Congress of the United States committed, according to the budget schemes, and who knows whether any of this budget arithmetic makes any sense, $360 million to guarantee $1 billion of U.S. loans to Ukraine. It has been unwilling to commit $330 million to undergird several $100 billion of IMF lending to support financial stability around the world, including a sum 15 times as great for Ukraine. It has failed to carry through on an arrangement to reconfigure the balance of power within the IMF, not that was imposed on the United States, but that was brokered by the United States. A period of secular stagnation, a period when credit for many purposes remains scarce, a period when surely more trade is more important, surely cannot be the right moment for the Export-Import Bank to be under unprecedented threat. And yet, it is. Serious people, being serious, contemplate that it would be the right thing to do to slash corporate taxes because we need to help businesses be more competitive. But when the objective is to help the whole product by supporting its export, including the workers' part of it, think that that should be entirely eliminated. And then there is the question of the development banks. Many of you in this room have in recent years been much closer to them than I. I cannot help but wonder whether we are not in a new era with respect to development banking when 60% of the world's poor live in countries with vast reserves far in excess of the liquidity need of the country in which they live, that are currently invested largely in U.S. Treasuries at a 0% yield. And when the flow of capital voluntarily is from developing countries to the industrial world. Surely the traditional mission of providing capital to those who are unable to borrow, at a minimum, needs to be rethought in a very important way. What should be some elements of that rethinking? First, it seems to me much more thought needs to be given to the intermediation of the very substantial sums of money that are now held by developing countries to do something more productive for their treasuries and for the global economy than to purchase liquid, unnecessarily liquid, low-yielding financial assets, whether it is investments in other developing countries, whether it is successful diversification vehicles to purchase riskier assets, whether it is strategies in a prudent way to invest more at home. Surely those huge quantities of reserves should be more of a concern of those focused on the international financial architecture than they have been in recent years. Surely also a concern with poverty, which has to be central in any thinking about economic development, needs to be combined with a concern about development in all of its aspects, a concern directed at the modernization of societies so that their people can live the kinds of lives that the people in this room take for granted. For much of the world, $1 a day is not a sufficient aspiration. And truly global development banks and truly global support for economic development must recognize that reality. We need to recognize that it's not about anymore, in the way it once might have been, there being enough money. The World Bank's annual lending levels now are not large relative to private banking levels. They're on the order of 2% of the private bank flows to the developing world. They are smaller than development banks or development bank type activities maintained by a number of individual developing countries like Brazil and China. And so it is that much more important that they be used in creative and catalytic ways, whether it is to catalyze money for infrastructure finance through innovative vehicles, whether it is to support transborder projects, whether it is to help subnational entities get access to the market, whether it is to accumulate resources that can be used to finance global public goods. Business as usual must not be the right business for these institutions. At the same time that there is this abundance of capital that looks for use, there is the global public goods question. The pandemic example that I gave is a particularly vivid example, but those concerned with research in agriculture could make a case. Those concerned with antibiotic resistance could make a similar case. Those concerned with new renewable energy technologies, which the success of which probably will be ultimately determinative of how we do with respect to global climate change, could make a similar case. Are the global institutions going to provide global public goods as a central part of what they do, or is that going to be an auxiliary part of their mission? That, too, is a crucial question going forward. There's also the question that I was struck by as I thought about events in Ukraine. The Marshall Plan was a great success. I've now been involved with the international financial system for about 20 years. And I have seen the call for a Marshall Plan-like success with respect to Russia, with respect to South Africa, with respect to Africa as a whole, with respect to Bosnia, with respect to Myanmar, with respect to East Timor, with respect to Cuba, with respect to the West Bank, with respect to the whole Middle East, with respect to the states of the former Soviet Union. And I think it is fair to say that in none of those cases was what the world did something that will be remembered as being even a third as successful as the Marshall Plan. And that has to suggest that we don't have quite the right tools, quite the right approaches. And probably it also says something about the difficulty of the problem. But how we adopt our instruments of support for economic development to the aftermath of wrenching political change is, on the way the world is going, likely to be an increasingly important challenge in the years ahead. I don't have the answers to any of these questions, whether it's post-conflict assistance, whether it's post-political change assistance, whether it's the mobilization of finance for global public goods, whether it's the more effective mobilization of global reserves. But I do know that these are huge and immense questions. And I do know this. It is a lesson of 1914, that economic integration and trade do not assure peace. But it is a lesson of much more history that economic disintegration and failure drive nationalism and almost assure conflict. And that is why the work of the Center for Global Development, that is why the kinds of innovative ideas that are your lifeblood, that is why are so important. And it is why American leadership in underwriting this global system is so important if the peace is to stay won and the remarkable development trends I have described are going to continue for another generation. Thank you very much.
Please have a seat. Good afternoon. Would you like some water, Secretary Summers? Should I call you Secretary Summers, Chairman Summers, President Summers? All of the above? Larry. That's great. You've had some of those positions that, you know, the title becomes an honorific that outlasts the office. So we may have to come up with some kind of special.
Bozo I wouldn't much like, but Larry will be fine.
Well, now I know how to press your buttons if I have to do that. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to talk with you. And I appreciate your remarks very much, and I want to dig into them a little bit and understand a little bit better where you're going. And I first want to start naturally by asking for some financial advice. I'll ask about my retirement plan later, but you made a remark about developing countries and where they put their money, and suggested that perhaps it was not the smartest investment to be putting them in U.S. Treasury bonds at effectively 0% interest. That raises so many interesting questions for me. First, because as a citizen, I'm aware that our economy would collapse tomorrow if they weren't doing this. So the money has to come from somewhere. But let's go back to the practical question. If you were advising the government of China, the government of India, the government of any number of countries that have done this with some portion of their reserves, what's something you would tell them to do with their money instead?
I would tell them that those reserves that meet any plausible liquidity contingency should be invested in the most liquid assets available. But I would invite them to consider how much of their reserves were plausibly being held to meet contingencies around liquidity. And I think they would conclude that a substantial part, in many cases, was not being held to meet plausible liquidity needs in a financial emergency.
In other words, they're being too safe.
And I would suggest, why pay a liquidity premium for liquidity that you do not require? And that would suggest moving out the maturity spectrum in order to get higher yields. It would suggest being prepared to take higher levels of credit risk in order to get higher yields. It would suggest being prepared to contemplate investments in equity in order to get equity risk premiums. And it would suggest being prepared to engage in private transactions, trade equity or real estate or commodity type transactions. This is a trend. The Norwegians do it. The oil-producing nations do it. The Koreans increasingly do it. This is a direction in which things are moving, but it seems to me that it's moving more rapidly would mean more resources for those national treasuries, would mean more funds for productive investment in other parts of the world would mean lower risk premia, which would contribute to macroeconomic health globally. Singapore has been doing this for 30 or 40 years to its very great advantage. And it seems to me that it is a trend that could very desirably be accelerated. I don't see any evidence that at plausible paces of the acceleration of this trend, there might be some effect on the slope of the term structure. There might be some changes in relative pricing that would be of interest to, over time, to hedge fund managers. But certainly in the global capital market, the United States will not have difficulty financing its debt.
Okay. Is this part of the weakness of China, or the relative weakness of China, that they're spending too much money investing in the United States, investing in the U.S. Treasury?
I don't think that's I think that is a relevant issue for Chinese financial management. I don't think it's one of the 10 most important structural issues facing China at this point. I think as one looks at China, one has to maintain an awareness of a, I think, very important stylized fact about economic development that gets too little attention. And that's this. If you look at the correlation in growth rates between countries, between one decade and the next, growth in the 70s and growth in the 80s, growth in the 80s and growth in the 90s, so forth, it is surprisingly low. It's greater than zero, but not a lot greater than zero. If you think about how people's imaginations operate, we assume that the countries that have grown rapidly for the last decade will grow rapidly for the next decade. But it actually isn't true. The tendency is not so strong. The normal thing, to use the statistician's term, is reversion towards the mean. This is, by the way, the reason why when an athlete gets on the cover of Sports Illustrated, they almost certainly go downhill next season. It's not because Sports Illustrated hurts them. It's because they got on the Sports Illustrated because they had a really good year, and on average, after you've had a really good year, you don't have quite as good a year
Then you
the
get
next
signed
year.
by the Yankees.
It's,
and then
yeah,
things get
exactly.
worse.
It's the same thing with countries. So I think the way in which the question is conventionally framed, which is China's an 8% or a 7% growth country, will something go wrong, or will it keep being that, is not actually the right way to think about it. The right way to think about it is that countries grow at a couple of percent per capita, and sometimes very good things happen to them and they grow substantially faster. And will very good things continue to happen in China? And it's not obvious to me that there's as much scope for the very good things that have happened over the last 30 years to continue to happen over the next decade, in part because those things have been associated with a reduction in the consumption share from 50% of GDP, which was remarkably low, to 33% of GDP, which is extraordinarily low, in part because of the various environmental challenges, in part because of the very great political challenges of maintaining a system where, on the one hand, control depends heavily on patronage, and on the other hand, control depends very crucially on legitimacy, which depends on the absence of corruption. And the balancing of those two things is a very, very profound challenge. So I think that the Chinese, one underestimates them at one's peril, and certainly one underestimates the new leadership at one's peril. But it seems to me that they do have immense challenges going forward. And it seems to me that as we in the West and we in the United States view it, there's a tendency for us to see the greatest threats as coming from excessive Chinese strength and rapid Chinese growth and the development of a blue water navy and tremendous growth and being surpassed in GDP. And certainly there are scenarios of that kind that should give concern. But there is also the concern that if growth disappoints, the legitimacy that for several decades has come from the fact that your life gets hugely better every decade, and that your children's life is incomparably different from yours. If that dynamic breaks down, the alternative available glue is nationalism. And nationalism in Asia has an unhappy history, and nationalism is not likely to particularly foment a close and effective relationship with the United States.
You're speaking carefully, you're not forecasting, but suppose that China did revert to the mean, as you suggested, that there's growth of something way less than 8%, 7% over the next decade or 2 decades. What's that mean for China? What's that mean for the rest of the developing world? What's it mean for the United States, if that were the future?
I want to say again what you said. I am not forecasting.
We're playing out a scenario here.
I am not forecasting. I do think that it's a lesson of experience that uncertainty is greater than you think, and that the range of possible outcomes exceeds the range of our imagination. No one foresaw the fall of the Berlin Wall in the spring of 1989. I have found in looking at the world that it is a very good rule that I learned from my old teacher, the late Rudy Dornbush, that things take longer to happen than you think they will, and then they happen faster than you thought they could. And that tends to be the way it is with financial collapses after bubbles. That tends to be the way it is with respect to economic takeoffs. That tends to be the way it is with technologies. If I had said to you in 2000, how long would it be till the electronic book, you actually would have guessed sooner than it proved to be. But if I'd asked you in 2010, how pervasive will the Kindle be in 2014, you wouldn't have expected it to move nearly as rapidly as it did. So I think that's a good rule in thinking about what's likely to happen in countries. Look, Chinese slowdown will mean a substantial slowdown in demand in the global economy, particularly with respect to commodities, and have a dramatic effect on commodity prices and all of those who are dependent on commodity exports. It will have a significant impact on anyone who produces products of a kind that sells to China at a time when the Chinese import market is a very large one in the global economy. It will likely mean more pressure in the short run on the rest of the world from increased Chinese exports, as it's associated with a decrease in the real value of the renminbi. And it is likely, in my judgment, to be associated with a China that is more concerned to assert its greatness and to assert its strength, and that will, for domestic political reasons, seek to attribute problems to international causes, whether or not that is a legitimate economic attribution or not. And so it seems to me that an additional implication of this is that, of course, we should look out for our commercial interests, but in a world where China could evolve in many different directions, I think we want to be careful to assure that it cannot reasonably be said that we were an important cause if outcomes are not everything that the Chinese would hope that they would be.
Meaning what? That we should make it very overt and public that we're trying to be a partner to the Chinese. Is that what you mean?
Yes, meaning that at this point, when the Chinese trade account, trade deficit, trade surplus has come way down, this is not the moment to turn the exchange rate into any kind of cause célèbre, that we set a goal in terms of the Chinese trade surplus. They achieved, it was a quantitative goal. They comfortably achieved that goal, and that part of being credible in the world is carrying through on threats that you issue, and another part of being credible in the world is being able to take yes for an answer, and when you set targets and they are achieved, being prepared to recognize that they have been achieved.
So don't push the Chinese too hard. Don't push them over the brink without quite realizing what we're doing. You talked about the possibility of a different China.
Steve, I've learned through much painful experience that I say what I say, and I don't assent to other people's attempt to reframe it without the various ambiguities and weasel words that I carefully advocated. So in case anybody's clear, I stand by what I said, and I do not accept any recharacterization of Steve's of what I have said.
Weasel words are a given when I clarify what the man said accurately. It's a joke. When you talked about the concern about Chinese nationalism, I wondered if that was part of your thinking when you expressed concern about a shrinking U.S. military.
My concern was not with respect to any particular adversary or any particular contingency. It's not my training to evaluate particular adversaries or particular contingencies. It seems to me there are two or three observations that I find pertinent. One is that if you think about the countries who you would think were most likely to be allied with us, their military budgets are in free fall. And if you think about the countries who are most likely to be our adversaries, their military budgets are rising rapidly. And perhaps in the face of that, it's appropriate for ours to be in free fall, but it would seem a little odd unless you thought we had been way overinvested to date. Second, I yield to no one in this room in my lack of enthusiasm for the Iraq War. And I am, I think, clear on the difficulties of what we have attempted in Afghanistan. At the same time, if I ask myself, in a world that is as dangerous and uncertain as the world we live in, should the United States have the capacity to maintain for several years a force abroad of 200,000 people, 40% of the size of the force that George Bush deployed in Desert One. It's hard for me, if such a contingency arose in the judgment of the President and Congress, it's hard for me to believe that the answer to that question is no, we shouldn't have that capacity. And the trajectory we are on is a trajectory that would call that question, call that capacity into serious question. You know, I read recently John Kennedy's book, Why England Slept. And it's actually a very different book than I expected. I expected it to be all about what I had learned, which was the terrible mistakes Chamberlain made at Munich and how terrible appeasement was and what a misguided strategy it was. That's what I expected it to be about. It actually wasn't about that at all. What it actually said was, and I'm not a historian, but it made the case in a way that was persuasive to me, was that Chamberlain had no choice at Munich. That given the configuration of power that existed at that moment, there was no other option besides appeasement and a certain amount of playing for time.
Meaning England
Now,
had lost because
meaning that England had to play for time. Well, England ultimately won, right? But England had to play for time at that moment. England didn't have an option to say no at that moment. Now there is no threat. I'm not going to tell you that Putin is Hitler, and I'm not telling you that I see anything like what Germany represented in the late 1930s right now. I don't want to be misunderstood. But I do think that, as I described earlier, it is a dangerous world. And I think the cleavage is not at this moment actually a cleavage between those who believe in hard power and those who believe in soft power. I think it's a cleavage between those who believe that the United States needs more than ever to be engaged in keeping the world safe, secure, and integrated in all the ways that one does that, and those who believe that because we've had difficult times at home, we can afford to take a generational holiday from history and focus on our domestic challenges only. And that, it seems to me, is where the litmus test and where the divides are in the debate. And that's a quite different divide than a more traditional divide, how much for defense and how much for development. I think the real issues are how much for the United States supporting and underwriting a global system. And I think you've got to recognize that the military is one part of that. It is only one part of it, but it is a part of it. And it seems to me that it is essential that we be prepared to be engaged with the world and not seek any kind of holiday from history.
You've used that phrase, underwriting the global system, a couple of times. The question gets asked, and so there should be a clear answer to it if there is one. Why should the United States be the one at this moment in history to be doing that underwriting as opposed to other rising nations that are becoming wealthier?
Most fundamentally, because there's no appreciable probability that it will be done if the United States does not do it. It is not remotely reasonable nor plausible to expect a country with 1/5 of the per capita income of the United States, with income levels that correspond to US income levels in 1930 on average, I'm speaking of China, to underwrite the global system. Much less to expect that India or developing countries much poorer still to underwrite the global system. That doesn't mean that they haven't and won't play an increasing role. That doesn't mean that with greater economic success and wealth don't come responsibilities as well as opportunities. It doesn't mean that we should be unafraid to call on them. But let's be clear. A U.S.-led agreement was brokered at the IMF. 179 other countries are ready to go on that agreement. Only one is not. Let's be clear. There's a major trade negotiation underway with respect to Asia. There is only one country where there's a serious question if an agreement is reached, whether that agreement will go into law. It is our country. Let's be clear. It may be that even with highly constructive U.S. action, that no successful global framework will be forged around global climate change. But it is absolutely clear that without the United States, there is no chance of an effective global agreement around climate change. Let's be clear, where is essentially all of the energy around the prevention of nuclear proliferation? It is something that comes from the United States. And so the strategy of the United States seeking to be one nation among many, hoping that comity, peace, cooperation, and integration will just rise up out of international dialogue, it seems to me is a strategy that is without successful historical precedent. And as Charlie Kindleberger wrote years ago, the prospects for success do depend upon there being a nation that is prepared to take a role in leading and guiding and reinforcing the global system.
I'm going to ask you one final question, then invite your questions here in just a moment. Nancy Birdsall referred to the 3 or 4 or 5 billion people on the bottom, if we want to think of them that way, that this institution aims to help. If you're in a developing country, you see very blatantly the divisions between the people on the top and everyone else. That's a greater and greater concern here in the United States. And I wonder if I can get you to range across the map and across the institutions that you know so well. And can you point us to one idea, however large or however small, that would narrow that gap between the people on the top and the billions on the bottom?
Like I said it 20 years ago, and I think I believe it today. If we educate girls who have been to primary and secondary school are far more likely to stay alive through childbirth, are likely to have smaller, happier, healthier families with children who are much more likely to grow up to be successful. And their influence in their society, whether it is in preventing external aggression or protecting plots of land so that they are farmed sustainably, will be that much greater. And all of that works to the benefit of those who are disadvantaged. And so it seems to me that when developing countries invest in girls' education, and when we use the influence that we have to support investment in girls' education, we are doing something that is very powerful to help those at the bottom. There is not a question as to whether the daughters of those at the top will learn to read. There still is, in substantial parts of the world, a question of whether the daughters of those at the bottom will learn to read. And fixing that, I think, is hugely important. We have come a long way, but we have a long way to go.
Okay, let me invite your questions. I'll just pick different people who have something to say. Go ahead right here, sir. And if you would stand up and go ahead, yeah, you right there. Go ahead, stand up and say your, is there a microphone that's coming around? Yes, there is. Please say your name just so that we get to know each other a little bit. And if you can be rather concise with your questions because time is limited.
Arvind Subramaniam at the Center for Global Development. Larry, a quick question. You spoke about the cost benefit on the IMF side, which seems such a no-brainer. On the trade side, which you didn't touch upon, in some ways the irony is that the US seems to be retreating from this Asia, the TPP and all of that, precisely at the moment when it's actually seeming to succeed, because China has changed its attitude to all kinds of trade, multilateral and bilateral, in a very positive way, combined with what's happening domestically. So at the very time when the strategy was working is when the US is kind of seeming to recede. So why is this happening in your view, this both on the finance side and on the trade side, when either it's very low, a huge benefit cost ratio, or it's succeeding on the trade side, and yet the US is unwilling to be whatever, the hegemon, cooperate, take leadership, underwrite, undergird, all these words you've used?
I think that's a question that can be answered at a couple levels, Arvind. One part of it is that it's a symptom of a broader dysfunctionality in our politics, increasing political polarization, increasing linkage of issues and hostage taking, increasing unwillingness of Congress to give presidents of the opposite party any kind of victory or any kind of success for partisan reasons. So, in one part, I think it's a symptom. I think it's a symptom of that kind of thing. I think a second part is a failure. I think he is a failure of elites to make a case for international integration. Basically, you can read the newspapers for a long time, and the thought that because of international trade, your real wage is higher because you can buy things cheaper, that thought does not appear. It is not in our national discourse. We analyze trade purely in mercantilist terms with the sort of basketball game model. When we export, that's like being on offense, and when we import, that's like being on defense. And the idea is to get more points. And the basic idea that trade means low-priced products, it's not in our national debate. And that economic stability in other countries doesn't mean we're doing worse in terms of competitiveness. It means we have larger markets. None of those non-zero-sum ideas are in our national debate. And that's a failure of communication, and it's a failure of education. And it's probably related to the fact that elites are, the elites who brought us, elites brought us Vietnam, and elites brought us Iraq, and elites brought us the financial crisis. And so the people don't think elites know much. And so there's a broad, and they're not 100% wrong maybe. And so there's a broad disillusionment with elites. And internationalism is kind of an elitist project. I mean, if you think about it, nobody did a focus group on the Marshall Plan. And if they had, the Marshall Plan might not have passed. And so I think a second part of this has to do with a general disillusionment with elites. And I think some of the disillusionment with elites has to do with the kind of phenomena I just talked about, and some of it has to do with the fact that it's in many ways gotten harder and more insecure to be in the middle class in the United States than it used to be. And people, when times are tough, people are more selfish. And that also contributes to the difficulties. I mean, I don't want to absolve political leaders in either party, but I think there are some more fundamental forces that are going on.
Right here, Nancy, go right ahead.
I was hesitating not to take up.
No, it's okay. Your name's on the room, so I think you're allowed.
So, Larry, I wanted to bring you down to earth a little bit on the World Bank, because you use the IMF as an example where the elite and the Congress and maybe political dysfunction in the U.S. are creating problems. You mentioned global public goods, and you know, and some others in the room know, we've for many years been suggesting that it would make sense to have the World Bank as the premier global development institution more engaged in dealing with global public goods, cross-border goods, and it doesn't have a way to do it now because its mainstream product is a loan to countries or guarantees to countries. And the global goods by nature are things that one country at a time doesn't want to borrow for. So in the remarks you made on the role of the U.S., which has been a very benign one in all the periods since World War II at a place like the World Bank, would you situate a little bit more what should the U.S. be pushing the World Bank to do? It has the votes, it has the shares, it has the leadership, but we don't feel anymore, maybe I'm wrong, but we don't feel anymore visibly a constructive role in terms of U.S. leadership with and through the World Bank any more than with and through the IMF.
I think it's very hard, given the look. I think to govern is to choose, and you can't do all possible good things. And there's an agenda of internationalist politically difficult things that's pretty long and is looking pretty challenging. The IMF, trade, to take the two leading parts of that agenda. It's a complex strategy to push the World Bank in some dimension if you're not then in a position to actually, once you've pushed and if you get everybody to agree, if you're not going to be able to deliver the money.
As at the IMF.
Well, that's what we did in the IMF. So I guess the question, so you're sort of asking, what should the U.S. push, and should the U.S. push within the World Bank? And I'm saying that in making a decision as the U.S., how hard to push, you do need to think about whether you're going to be able to deliver at the end of pushing. And I think that is a real challenge right now. And the United States has a high ratio of commitments to delivery, and pushing people to delivery, it's not just this, it's the International Criminal Court. I mean, there are a variety of things where the United States has pushed and failed to deliver, and everyone who's concerned about a particular issue never is worried about the fact that the United States is acquiring a general credibility problem. They just want the United States to push for the right agenda on the issue they particularly care about. But that is a thing which U.S. policymakers, I think, prudently have to be very, very mindful of. It seems to me that if you wave aside that set of questions, it seems to me there are at least three strategies that one should be thinking about. One is financial engineering for greater profitability, with the profits then allocated towards financing global public goods, and the World Bank has a variety of special attributes: preferred creditor status, the AAA ability to borrow that would permit desirable financial engineering. And then the question is, how much of that are you going to spend on imposing process on developing countries? And so you have to keep the rate very low because you're imposing a lot of process on developing countries that borrow from you. And how much are you going to let up on your process requirements and then let the rate rise and then have more money to do other things? And I can't help but wonder whether the process requirements haven't become very burdensome, and whether more money for global public goods wouldn't be a higher calling than more process requirements on borrowers. So that would be one. More financial product innovation would be the first area that I would think about. Second area is simply setting up non-sidelight structures to receive funds, so that they're not trust funds that are on the side, but are central and respected parts of the institution, possibly with the capacity to make equity investments, as well as to make loans. It seems to me is a second strategy. And it seems to me a third strategy is greater engagement with the world of philanthropy. I mean, one of the consequences of rising inequality and shrinking governments, shrinking government willingness to support foreign assistance, is a change in the balance between public and philanthropic efforts. $2 trillion worth of wealth has taken the giving pledge, where there's a pledge to give away half the money. That's $1 trillion that's been pledged to give away. The annual return on that $100 billion, on that $1 trillion, without dipping into the corpus, is $50 billion. Now, that $50 billion is going to go for many, many things, and many of them will have nothing to do with economic development, and many that have to do with economic development will be purely local. But you're not talking about small sums of money. And on the evidence of current trends, if you look at what's happening to the Forbes 400 and you look at the success that is being had in getting more people to sign up to the Giving Pledge, those numbers look to rise rapidly. And I think thinking about how development banks can engage constructively with that. Now, I think it's probably fair to say, having had a little bit of exposure to both worlds, that the culture of the multilaterals is, to put it mildly, a tad different from the culture of the Silicon Valley instant billionaire. And so it's going to take a lot of work to make that combination in an effective way, but it seems to me the stakes are very large.
There's a woman at this table who has a question right here. If you'll stand up, ma'am. Yeah.
Hi, Liliana Rojas Suarez here from the Center too. Larry, you mentioned the issue of foreign exchange reserves held by central banks. Every central bank in developing country and emerging market is fully aware of your issue, as you know. They know that it's very costly. They know that they would like to invest it in somewhere else. There has to be a reason why they don't. And the reason is that there doesn't exist in the world something like an international lender of last resort. The provision of liquidity, something like the flexible exchange credit line like the IMF started, but that was very limited and of course doesn't serve the function. You also mentioned that the United States is the country that would make things happen or don't. And the US certainly will not approve the IMF to be the lender of last resort. So in a context like that, wouldn't you be in favor of more regional centers for provision of liquidity. Like the Asians are going that way, but didn't work well. There's a small fund in Latin America, the Latin America Reserve Fund, which actually worked very well during the crisis. So what would you do? I mean, there is more than 150 central bankers in the world that are fully aware of your issue.
Let me say two things. First, I've seen this movie. I would say there are a number of I've had the experience in a number of countries where I say, well, why don't you invest more of your reserves abroad, and in a less liquid form for higher return. And they say, well, we really need the money for liquidity, and until we get our reserves up to X, we really don't think that would be prudent. And then I come back 4 years later, and their reserves are 1.4x, and say, okay, well, now you're 40% above the target you set. What about it now? And they say, well, now we think we need to be 40% above where we are now. So, it's a well-known observation about human beings that what would constitute having a high enough income where you'd really feel everything was terrific? And experience with human beings is that the answer to that question is 50% above their current income. And that's true almost regardless of what their current income is. And there's something like that with respect to the central bankers. So in some of the cases, it is not plausible that the reason they are holding so much liquidity is because they can't, is because they think they'll really need that much liquidity in a crisis, and they worry about the lack of unconditional liquidity being provided to them. I mean, China is not worried that $3 trillion is not enough. And there are other cases that have somewhat that character. So I would resist a bit your characterization of it. That said, I'd be very supportive of a whole range of pre-planning for liquidity, whether it is the NAFTA group swap lines that have existed in North America since NAFTA, whether it is similar things in Asia, similar things in South America. I am all for innovation in that regard, and it's not really our subject for today, but I've been on the record for a long time with the view that a lot of damage has been done in the world by moral hazard fundamentalism, and that it seems to me that the flip side of moral hazard is confidence, and that confidence is a good thing, and that in our enthusiasm for resisting moral hazard, we sometimes undermine confidence.
Moral hazard fundamentalism has to be our last word for this afternoon. So please join me in thanking Larry Summers. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy that.
Good to hear you.
Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, Steve.